I still remember the way her voice cut through the phone line like a dull knife. "We cannot have you this Christmas, Dad." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could carry. My daughter said it like a line, rehearsed, neat and final. No room for protest. No crack for a father to slip his heart into. I had been standing in the kitchen, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling beside the radio. Outside, the trees were stripped bare, their branches scratching the gray sky. It was early December, cold enough that the windows breathed white. And yet in that moment it felt as if every wall in the house had pulled away from me, leaving me alone in a cavern. I wanted to ask why, I wanted to demand an answer, but all I heard was the hum of her silence before the call ended. That house I had lived in for 30 years suddenly seemed too big. I could hear the ticking of the old clock above the mantel every second nagging at me. The living room was lined with photo frames, each one catching me with a smile from the past. My wife's laughter preserved in one picture, my children as toddlers sprawled on a blanket in another, and a family Christmas from long ago, when the air smelled of pine and cinnamon, and no one thought to question where I belonged. I leaned against the counter and let the memory press itself against me, wondering when a father becomes unnecessary. The truth is, I am 71 years old, retired from the postal service, a man who has delivered more letters than he can count, yet found himself unprepared for the blunt delivery of rejection from his own flesh and blood. I live alone in the same 2-story house in Indiana where my children grew up. The garage still holds my old toolbox. The shelves are stacked with paint cans, and there is a lawn mower that hasn't run since spring. I cook simple meals, oatmeal in the mornings, soup at night, and I keep the television running in the evenings just to drown out the echo of empty rooms. I am not sick, not dying, not senile. I still drive my Buick to the grocery store twice a week. But apparently, I am not fit for Christmas. I sat down in my chair and replayed the words in my head. My daughter's name is Claire. She is 41 now, married with 2 children of her own. She used to call me her rock when she was little, clinging to my legs when she was scared. "Daddy will fix it," she would say. I was the man who taught her how to ride a bike, who clapped when she sang in the church choir, who stayed up late to check her homework. Now she tells me not to come. The distance between then and now felt like a canyon, and I stood on the wrong side of it. Later that evening, my son Mark called, his voice casual, distracted. "Dad, I heard about Christmas. Don't take it personal. It's just Claire wants to keep things simple this year." I wanted to ask him what could be simpler than a father at the table carving turkey, telling his old stories. But Mark spoke fast, as though brushing past me, promising to catch up soon before hanging up. The line went dead, and so did the warmth in my chest. I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood. The Petersons across the street had already strung their lights, the house glowing in red and green. I could see silhouettes moving inside, children laughing. The world seemed full of gatherings, yet my own family had shut the door. I touched the cold glass and thought of all the Christmas mornings when I had woken before everyone made coffee, checked the stockings, and waited for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. The air had always been alive with expectation. This year it was filled with a silence that felt like punishment. I tried to busy myself the next day, cleaning the garage, sorting through boxes. I found an old train set Mark had once begged for its tracks, rusted but still intact. I remembered the way his eyes had widened when he first saw it under the tree. I remembered the year Claire wanted nothing but a red sweater and wore it for 3 winters straight. These memories came like ghosts, reminding me of a man I once was, a father they once cherished. Somewhere along the line, time had thinned the fabric between us until it tore. That evening, Claire called again. Her tone was softer, but still firm. "Dad, it's just too much this year. The kids have school events. Tom's parents are coming and we don't have the space." I listened, my jaw clenched, feeling the weight of every excuse. "I understand," I said finally, though the words tasted bitter. "You all have a good Christmas." There was a pause. Then she said, "Love you, Dad," before hanging up. I sat in the dark afterward, the only light coming from the small lamp on the side table, and I wondered if love was meant to sound so convenient. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the fan blade slicing the shadows. I could not escape the thought that I had been quietly erased. A father who once carried the world on his shoulders reduced to an afterthought, a burden to be managed. My chest tightened, but not from anger. It was something deeper, a sorrow that filled every vein. Yet beneath it, something else began to stir. A spark of defiance, a whisper telling me I wasn't finished, not ready to fold myself away into loneliness. When morning came, frost on the windows, and the yard glazed in white, I made myself a decision. I would not beg for a seat at their table. If my presence was too much for them, I would find another way to remind them who I was. I poured my coffee, black and hot, and opened the laptop that still sat on the dining table. The screen glowed as I searched for flights. My finger hovered, my heart steady. They said I could not have Christmas with them. Fine. I would take Christmas somewhere else, and I would make it count. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The cursor blinked on the screen, as if it too were waiting for me to make up my mind. Flights to Denver, Chicago, Orlando, even farther if I wanted. The thought of leaving this house behind for a while gave me an odd relief, like loosening a belt after a heavy meal. Still, my hands trembled slightly on the keys. I was not a man who traveled often. The farthest I had gone in recent years was a drive to Louisville for a cousin's funeral. Airports had become places I only saw on the news, crowded with rushing people and announcements I could hardly catch. But I told myself I had stood in worse places before. I had carried bags heavier than any suitcase when I was younger, mail sacks slung over my shoulder in snowstorms, trudging through streets until my knees burned. The sky had never stopped me then, and it would not stop me now. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The house around me smelled faintly of cedar from the old chest in the hallway. There were pencil marks still etched on the doorframe, where Claire and Mark once measured their height every summer. My thumb ran over the groove of the table's edge, worn from years of family dinners. These walls had seen birthdays, arguments, Christmas mornings, and nights of laughter when my wife was alive. Evelyn had passed 10 years ago, but I still felt her presence in the quiet moments, as though she lingered in the spaces between shadows. She would not have liked what our children had become. Or perhaps she would have understood them in ways I could not. I thought about my work days, the decades spent as a postal worker. People trusted me with their letters, with messages of joy and grief. I delivered birthday cards, wedding invitations, final notices, and news of death. Rain soaked me, dogs barked at me, yet I kept walking. That job taught me something about endurance. Every day was a route to finish, no matter how heavy the load or how empty the streets. Maybe this trip I was planning was just another route, a road of my own, choosing proof that I was still capable of carrying something forward. The sting of Claire's words had not left me, though. At night, I replayed the conversation, her voice cool and practical. She had once been a girl who begged me to string lights higher on the roof, who watched me hammer them in place while she clapped her mittened hands. She used to believe that I could climb anywhere, fix anything. Now she said there was no room. How does a father shrink in his own child's eyes? I tried to measure it, but the math never added up. I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper writing down small lists. Clothes to pack places I might want to see. But the words blurred as memories intruded. I thought of Evelyn standing at the stove, stirring gravy, her back turned, but her ear always tuned to the children's laughter. I thought of the Christmas when Mark knocked over the tree ornaments scattering across the floor, and we had all laughed until our stomachs hurt. These images came with a weight that pressed into my chest. I whispered aloud, "What happened to us?" The walls gave me no answer. Neighbors stopped me on the street that week. Mrs. Henderson, wrapped in her heavy scarf, asked if the kids were coming for the holidays. I told her no, forcing a smile, saying they were busy. She patted my arm kindly, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the one that recognized loneliness when it saw it. I carried the weight of that look back to my house, and it sat with me like an unwelcome guest. Inside, I busied myself with small rituals. I oiled the hinges of the front door, replaced a flickering bulb in the hallway, swept the porch. Each task filled a corner of silence, but never the whole of it. At night, I sat with the old photo albums, flipping pages that smelled faintly of dust and time. There was Claire in her prom dress, nervous but smiling. There was Mark in his football uniform, grinning despite a missing tooth. There was Evelyn, always Evelyn, the light in her eyes captured by a lens but still alive in my heart. I found myself talking to her photograph. "They don't want me, Evie. Not this year. But I'll show them I'm not finished." That determination hardened when I drove past the travel agency downtown. In the window, glossy posters showed beaches, mountains, cities alive with lights. I parked the Buick and went inside, greeted by the scent of paper and ink. A young man behind the desk asked where I wanted to go. His hair was slicked back, his shirt pressed neat. I hesitated, staring at the world spread out in pamphlets, feeling the stirrings of a freedom I had long forgotten. I picked up a brochure of Alaska snow-capped peaks under a sky painted with green light. My breath caught. Christmas under the northern lights. What could be more fitting for a man pushed out of the warmth of his own hearth? That night, I laid the brochure on the table and stared at it while the clock ticked. I imagined myself standing beneath that sky, sending pictures back to Claire and Mark, showing them what they had missed. Not in anger, but in a quiet way that would speak louder than any words I could muster. They would see me alive, still burning with life, while they huddled in their small circle without me. I turned off the lamp, but the image of those green lights would not leave my mind. They danced across the darkness, stubborn and bright. And for the first time in years, I felt a thrill in my bones. My heart beat steady as I realized the truth. I was not simply planning a trip. I was planning a lesson. The idea of a lesson sat heavy in my chest, not the kind written on a chalkboard, but the sort you deliver by simply living it out. Still doubt kept tugging at me. Was I being petty, chasing after some revenge dressed up as self-respect? I told myself it was not about revenge. It was about dignity. A man who spent his life carrying others' letters should not be cast aside like junk mail. I called Claire the next evening, partly to test the waters, partly to hear her voice. She answered quickly as though she had been expecting me. "Dad, everything okay?" She asked, her tone clipped. I told her I was thinking of traveling for Christmas somewhere far. There was silence, followed by a sigh. "If that's what you want," she said. But there was something in her voice, a trace of annoyance, like she had hoped I would simply fade into the background instead of making plans of my own. "I'll be fine," I said. "I won't trouble you." "Dad, it's not about trouble," she replied, though she didn't explain what it was about. "We'll call you Christmas morning, all right?" She said it like an afterthought, as though a phone call could replace presents laughter and the carving of turkey. I felt my teeth grind, but I kept my voice calm. Of course, after we hung up, I sat in the dim light and let the bitterness spread. I realized it wasn't just this year. For years now, I had been gently pushed aside. Fewer visits, shorter phone calls, birthdays marked with hurried messages instead of dinners. When my knees first started aching, Claire had suggested I move into assisted living. "It might be easier, Dad," she had said, not realizing how the words cut. I was still mowing my lawn, then still fixing leaky faucets, still alive in every way that mattered. To suggest I belonged in a place where the forgotten waited out their days felt like betrayal disguised as care. Mark wasn't much better. He had borrowed money from me 2 years ago to fix his roof after a storm. I gave it without hesitation. He promised to pay me back within the year. I never saw $1 of it, and when I hinted, he waved me off with a joke. "Come on, Dad, you don't need it. You're fine." I let it go, but the sting remained. A father's savings, scraped from years of work, dismissed as if it were nothing. They had grown used to taking me for granted, and maybe that was the deeper wound. Not that they excluded me from Christmas, but that they no longer saw me as a man of weight in their lives. I went out to the garage and opened the old chest where I kept Evelyn's keepsakes. Among them was a small box of Christmas ornaments she had collected over the years. Each one had a story. A ceramic angel from our first Christmas as husband and wife. A wooden sled carved by Mark in shop class. A glass bell Claire had picked from a market stand when she was 12. I held that bell in my hand, running my thumb over its smooth surface, and felt the ache of being erased. Those ornaments had been the proof of a family once whole. Now they lay boxed away unwanted. That night, I could not sleep. I wandered the house, each creak of the floorboards, reminding me of footsteps long gone. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, and sat at the dining table staring at the Alaska brochure. I imagined the photographs I would take, sending them in a group message, letting the colors of the northern lights speak the words I could not find. But even as I thought of it, anger rose. Why should I need to prove myself to my own children? Why should I stage a performance just so they remembered my worth? The phone buzzed near midnight. It was Mark. His voice was slightly slurred as if he had been drinking. "Dad, listen, Claire means well. She just wants to keep things easy. Don't take it so hard." "Easy for who?" The words burned on my tongue, but I kept them back. "She means well," he repeated softer now. "Don't make a big deal out of it." A big deal. That was what they thought of me. A potential inconvenience, a complication in their smooth holiday. I felt something harden inside me. I was done being managed, done being treated like a relic to be dusted off when convenient. After Mark hung up, I sat in silence, the whiskey warming my throat. In that moment, I knew the trip was not just a choice. It was necessary. It was the first true act of defiance I had left. I would go, and I would live Christmas on my own terms. They would see it, and maybe they would finally understand the cost of pushing a man away. The next morning the frost had thickened on the windows, and the yard lay under a brittle sheet of ice. I went out to start the Buick, the engine coughing before it caught. As I scraped the windshield, I saw Mrs. Henderson waving from across the street. She called out, "Going somewhere, Frank?" I hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "Somewhere they'll remember." When I closed the garage door behind me, the house seemed to echo differently, as though it knew I was preparing to leave it behind for a while. The decision felt solid, carved into the marrow of me. Yet just as I turned off the light, I noticed something on the workbench, an envelope unsealed with Claire's handwriting. I picked it up, heart thudding. Inside was a folded letter I had never seen. The paper in my hands shook more than I wanted to admit. Claire's handwriting, neat and careful, pulled me back years in an instant. I had watched her practice those loops and curves at the dining table when she was a girl, her tongue pressed between her lips as she tried to match the cursive in her workbook. Now those same letters carried a weight I wasn't ready for. I unfolded the page, expecting maybe a note meant for the children, something mislaid. But the words were for me. "Dad, I don't know how to say this out loud. You can be hard to be around. The kids get tense. Tom says it too. I think sometimes you don't realize how much space you take, how your moods hang in the air. Maybe it's just easier for everyone if we do things smaller this year." The letter blurred for a moment as my eyes filled not from weakness, but from the shock of seeing myself written down as a burden. I pressed the page flat on the bench and read it again, slower this time, letting each word stab where it wanted. Hard to be around. Take up too much space. My own daughter, the girl I once carried on my shoulders through county fairs, the one who fell asleep in my lap while I read her stories, now painting me as something heavy to be managed. I set the paper down carefully, as though any sudden move might shatter it. Anger flared quick, but underneath it was something colder. A hollow recognition. Maybe this had been building longer than I admitted. The shorter visits, the way Tom barely looked up from his phone when I came by the grandkids, slipping off to their rooms after a stiff hello. The letter wasn't the spark. It was the gasoline poured over years of quiet neglect. I carried it back inside and laid it on the kitchen table. I made coffee black and bitter and stared at the page while the morning light crept across the linoleum. Memory after memory rose unbidden. Claire at 13 screaming that I was unfair for grounding her. Mark at 17 cursing me for making him quit a party early. The slammed doors, the grudges, the apologies that never fully healed. Families wound each other in ways that linger. Maybe mine had been tallying their wounds longer than I knew. The phone rang mid-morning. It was Claire again. Her voice was brisk, businesslike. "Dad, I just wanted to check if you're all right. You sounded strange last night." I looked at the letter on the table, my hand tightening around the receiver. "I'm fine," I said. "Making plans." "What kind of plans?" she asked, quickly, suspicion in her tone. "Travel," I replied. "Christmas under the northern lights." There was a pause, then a sharp edge. "Dad, is this about what I said? About not coming? You don't have to prove anything." The laugh that slipped out of me was humorless. "Don't I?" Before she could respond, I ended the call. My chest throbbed, but it wasn't guilt. It was something heavier, like steel hardening in a forge. Later, Mark stopped by unannounced. His truck rattled into the driveway and he came in without knocking. He looked around the kitchen, saw the letter, and frowned. "She left that here?" he asked. I didn't answer. He picked it up, read quickly, then tossed it back down. She didn't mean it like that, Dad. You know how she is. Always making things sound bigger than they are. Bigger, I said, my voice low. That's what you call this. He shifted uncomfortably. You've been difficult sometimes. You get set in your ways. The kids notice. Tom notices. I notice. The words hit me harder than the letter. My own son standing in the house I had built with my hands, telling me I was difficult. I remembered the nights I had carried him half asleep from the car to his bed, the mornings I packed his lunches, the time I drove through a blizzard to watch him play in a game that got canceled anyway. I had been difficult. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to shout. Instead, I said quietly, "Get out, Mark." He looked startled. "Dad, come on. Get out." Something in my tone made him obey. He muttered something about calling later, then slammed the door behind him. I sat alone again, the house vibrating with silence. By afternoon, the anger had turned into a steady throb, like a wound you press just to feel alive. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photographs, the remnants of a family that once revolved around me. Each object whispered that I was not imagining things. They had shifted me from the center to the edges, and now they were pushing me out entirely. That evening I dug out my old leather suitcase. It smelled of attic dust and cedar, its handle worn smooth. I placed it on the bed and began folding clothes, methodical, deliberate. Each shirt, each pair of socks was more than fabric. They were declarations. I am not finished. I am not erased. I am still moving. As I zipped the case, a photo slipped from between folded sweaters. It was Evelyn sitting by the Christmas tree, her smile as bright as the lights behind her. She had written on the back in her neat script, "For all our Christmases together." I held it tight, and for the first time in years I spoke aloud to her empty side of the bed. They think I take up too much space, Evie. But I'll show them how much space a man can truly fill. The house creaked, as though answering, and in that moment I swore I heard the faintest sound of a bell ringing the glass ornament Claire had chosen so long ago. When I turned, it was on the floor, shattered into glittering shards. The shards of that glass bell caught the light like frozen tears across the carpet. I stood there staring at them, the photo of Evelyn still clenched in my hand. For a moment I thought of sweeping it up, tucking the memory back into its box, pretending it had never fallen. But the truth was already scattered, impossible to put back the way it was. The bell had been delicate, fragile, just like the bond I thought still tied me to Claire. Now both lay broken, sharp enough to draw blood if I touched them wrong. I sank into the armchair with a heaviness that pressed me down deeper than the cushions. The suitcase sat half-packed on the bed upstairs, yet I felt no triumph, no sense of defiance. What came instead was collapse. My chest caved, my throat tightened, and for the first time in years I let myself cry, not the quiet tears shed at funerals or hospital beds, but the raw kind that shake a man's whole frame. I cried for Evelyn, for the Christmas mornings we had built together, for the small hands that once reached for mine and now pulled away. I cried for the man I used to be and the stranger I had become in my children's eyes. The house absorbed it, all the walls listening without judgment. When the storm inside me eased, I was left hollow. I poured another drink and walked through the rooms one by one, like a man visiting a museum of his own life. In the hallway hung Mark's football jersey, framed the year his team went to state. He had grinned when I surprised him with the frame, saying I was proud of him, no matter the score. In the kitchen drawer, I found Claire's old recipe cards, the ones she scribbled as a teenager when she tried to bake cookies with Evelyn. The handwriting was messy, then not yet the precise loops that cut me open in that letter. Every corner of this house bore proof of the father I had been, the man who gave everything he had. And still it had not been enough. The phone rang again, breaking the silence. This time it was Claire's husband, Tom. His voice was flat, carrying the courtesy of a man who wanted to get something unpleasant out of the way. "Frank, I just wanted to be clear. Christmas is tight this year. The kids are older now. They have their routines, their space. It's not personal. Not personal." The words burned worse than Claire's letter. I gripped the receiver tighter. "Not personal," I repeated. "When a man is told he has no place at his own family's table, you call that not personal." Tom sighed, and I could almost see him rubbing his temples. "You have a strong presence, Frank. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Claire gets anxious, the kids pick up on it. We just need things calmer this year." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Overwhelming, strong presence. They had twisted what once was a strength into a flaw. I had built my life on being solid, unshakable, the one who stood when others fell. And now that same weight was the reason I was cast aside. After he hung up, the air in the house felt poisoned. I paced from room to room, every step stirring up old arguments, old cracks that had never been sealed. I remembered the night Evelyn was rushed to the hospital, her heart failing faster than the doctors could steady it. Claire had blamed me for not calling sooner. Mark had shouted that I should have seen the signs. But I had been there. I had begged the nurses I had held her hand while she slipped away. They forgot that part. They only remembered the failure, and maybe they carried it still tucked under their polite words, fueling the quiet distance that had grown since. By midnight, I was exhausted, yet no rest came. I sat in the dark living room with Evelyn's picture propped on my knee. My voice came out hoarse. "Evie, I tried. I gave them everything I knew how. Why isn't it enough?" The silence that followed pressed in until I thought I would choke. I realized then that this trip was not just about showing them something. It was about saving what was left of me before I disappeared completely. The next morning I called the travel agency. My voice was steady as I booked the ticket to Anchorage. Christmas under the northern lights. The clerk on the other end sounded cheerful, asking if I had ever been before. "No," I said. "But it's time." When I hung up the confirmation email printed from the old machine on my desk, the sound of the paper feeding through like an announcement. I held it in my hands, the black ink proof of my decision. Yet even in that moment, the wound deepened. I thought of the grandkids, their faces lit by screens instead of firelight, their stockings empty of my hand-carved trinkets. I thought of how one day they might look for me and find only absence. That pain pressed against my ribs until it felt like something inside would crack. I staggered back to the kitchen and leaned on the counter, my breath uneven. The world tilted just enough to remind me of my age, of how fragile even the strongest foundations become. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The letter Claire had written was no longer on the table. I turned sharply, heart hammering, but the surface was bare. Only Evelyn's photo remained, her eyes locked on mine. I searched the floor, the counters, even the trash, but the page was gone as though it had never existed. That was when the phone rang again, and this time it was not Claire or Mark. It was a voice I hadn't heard in decades. The voice on the line carried me backward through time. It was Samuel, my younger brother. We had not spoken in over 20 years, not since Evelyn's funeral, when grief sharpened our tongues and pride made the distance permanent. His tone was gravelly, touched with age, but steady. "Frankie said I heard you might be spending Christmas alone." I sat down hard in the chair, Evelyn's photo still in my other hand. "How the hell did you know that? Word gets around," he replied simply. "Mark's boy posted something online, something about family plans, or rather the lack of them." He paused, his breath heavy in the receiver. "I thought I'd call. Maybe it's time." The silence between us held years of unspoken anger, but underneath it, I felt a stir of something warmer. A chance, perhaps, to rebuild at least one bridge. Yet the ache of my children's rejection was still too raw. "I've already booked a trip," I said. "Alaska, Christmas under the northern lights." For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. Then he chuckled, low and slow. "Sounds like you finally figured out how to live for yourself." His words hung in the air like smoke. Before I could answer, he said he would call again, then hung up, leaving me staring at the silent receiver. I set it down and drew a long breath. Something had shifted. My heart still hurt, but it no longer felt collapsed under its own weight. The image of those broken ornaments and the missing letter lingered, but now they seemed like markers on a road, not the end of it. I felt a resolve grow in me, sharper than grief. For years I had defined myself by what I gave, by how well I filled the spaces others left. Now perhaps it was time to define myself by what I claimed. I went back to the suitcase and packed with a steadier hand. Each item folded was a choice. Thermal shirts, wool socks, my old leather gloves cracked at the knuckles. Into the side pocket, I slipped Evelyn's photo, careful and precise. If she could not sit beside me, she would still see what I saw. I told myself that in some quiet way, this trip would belong to us both. As I worked, memories rose, not the bitter ones of slammed doors and harsh words, but the gentler moments. Claire, at 6 years old, lying on the floor coloring, while Evelyn hummed in the kitchen. Mark, at 9, asleep in the back seat as snow fell heavy on the windshield, the world muffled in white. For the first time in weeks, those memories did not crush me. They steadied me. They reminded me of the man I had been, not the relic they now believed me to be. I checked my wallet, the leather thin cards lined neatly inside. I still had enough saved, not just for the ticket, but for the extras, meals, excursions, maybe even a guided trip out onto the ice fields. For decades I had saved for them for birthdays, braces, college fees, broken cars. Now for the first time the savings would go to me. The thought carried both guilt and exhilaration. That night I slept more soundly than I had in weeks. I dreamed of lights rippling across a black sky, green, and gold ribbons twisting like a celestial dance. I woke with the image burning behind my eyes, and I smiled. The ache was still there, but it no longer ruled me. The next morning brought a new strength. I brewed coffee and called the travel agency to confirm details. The clerk told me my ticket was set hotel reserved. I thanked her, my voice firm. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and let the sound of the clocks ticking settle into me. Every second felt like forward motion. I knew Claire would call again. Maybe Mark, too. Their words would be the same easy dismissive laced with excuses. But I was done letting them frame my worth. If they wanted distance, they could have it. I would give them something to stare at from afar, a father not diminished, but burning brighter for having been pushed aside. That evening I went out to the shed and pulled down my old camera from a dusty shelf. It was Evelyn's once a gift I had bought her when the kids were small. She loved catching them mid-laughter flour on their noses, grass stains on their jeans. I turned it over in my hands, the leather strap cracked but sturdy. I would bring it with me. I would take photographs of everything Alaska had to offer, and those images would find their way to my children's phones, their living rooms, their quiet evenings. They would see what they had chosen to miss. I stood in the shed doorway as the sun slid low, painting the snow with copper light. The cold stung my lungs, but it felt bracing, like a call to keep moving. For the first time in months, I did not feel like a burden. I felt like a man with a plan, with miles ahead of him. Back inside, I checked the suitcase one last time, then set it by the door. I sat in the armchair, Evelyn's photo resting on the armrest beside me. My body was tired, but my mind was alive, sharper than it had been in years. I thought of Samuel's voice, the surprise of it. Maybe I had lost my children for now, but perhaps there were bonds not yet broken. Perhaps the story wasn't finished. As the house settled into night, I turned off the lamp and let the dark wrap around me. Then, faint as a whisper, I heard the sound again, the ringing of a bell. Not from the floor where the ornament had shattered, not from any place I could name, but clear and distinct, carrying through the stillness. I sat upright, heart pounding the photograph, slipping from my knee. And this time the ringing didn't stop. The ringing drilled through the quiet until I could no longer sit still. I rose, every nerve taut, following the sound down the hallway. My hands brushed the walls like I was searching for proof that the house still held me. In the kitchen, the ringing stopped. Silence pressed in again, heavy and unbroken. On the counter sat the old glass jar of coins Evelyn used to keep for Christmas stockings. I hadn't touched it in years. The lid was half open, though I knew I had left it sealed. My skin prickled. Whether it was my imagination or something beyond it, the message was clear enough. Go. The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. I loaded the Buick, the suitcase, snug in the trunk, the camera resting on the passenger seat. My heart pounded steady, not from fear, but from anticipation. At the airport, I moved through the lines, slowly, cane in hand, but with a straight back. I felt eyes on me, the kind of glances strangers give an old man traveling alone, half pity, half respect. Let them look. Every step I took was a strike against the coffin my children had tried to build for me. When I boarded the plane, I sent a simple message in the family group chat, "Gone to Alaska. Merry Christmas." Claire's reply came within minutes. "Dad, what do you mean? Where are you really?" I smiled grimly and turned the phone off. Hours later, I stepped into the bite of Alaskan air sharper than anything Indiana could conjure. The sky was a dark canvas, the ground crusted white, the mountains carved in silence. I breathed it deep, letting the cold cut into me because it reminded me I was still alive. At the hotel, I unpacked, carefully laying Evelyn's photo on the nightstand. "We made it," I whispered. The first excursion was arranged for Christmas Eve. A small group gathered with a guide who promised the best chance to see the northern lights. We rode out on a bus bundled in heavy parkas, faces red with cold. I sat quietly, the camera in my lap, listening to the chatter of couples and families. None of them knew the storm that had brought me here, but it didn't matter. Out on the open ice, the sky began to shift, faint green threads weaving across the stars. My chest tightened. When the full ribbons spilled across the heavens, shimmering with gold and violet, I raised the camera. Through the lens, I caught their movement slow and eternal, and I pressed the shutter again and again. I thought of Claire and Mark, their children glued to glowing screens, their homes wrapped in small comforts. They had refused me, but now they would see me against this sky, a figure dwarfed by glory, yet unbroken. I would send them images no apology could erase. Back at the hotel, I turned the phone on and sent the first photograph. The aurora stretched across the screen with my silhouette standing beneath it. I typed only 3 words, "Merry Christmas anyway." Claire's response came within minutes, a flood of messages. "Dad, where are you? Why didn't you tell us this is dangerous? You shouldn't be alone there." Her panic bled through each word, and I could almost hear her voice rising the way it had when she was a girl caught in a lie. Mark chimed in next, his tone less angry, more unsettled. "Dad, you didn't have to do this. We would have figured something out." I stared at their messages until my vision blurred, but not from sorrow this time. I felt something fierce stir in me, almost like triumph. They had expected me to vanish quietly, to take their dismissal with a bowed head. Instead, I was showing them a horizon larger than anything they had imagined for me. Their surprise was the fuel I needed. I sent another photo, this one of my hand holding Evelyn's picture with the lights flaring behind it. No words, just proof of presence, of history, of love they could not erase. The typing bubbles blinked, then vanished, then blinked again. They didn't know what to say. That night, I sat by the hotel window, the glass fogging with my breath. For the first time in years, I felt not like a ghost in my own family, but like a man who had seized back his story. My children's panic was not cruelty. Now it was recognition. They had seen me. They could not look away. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from Claire or Mark. It was from an unknown number 1 I had not saved, though I knew it instantly. Samuel. A text, not a call. 4 words. "I'm here too, Frank." I looked out into the night, the aurora still dancing faint above the mountains, and felt my pulse hammer. The message from Samuel burned on the screen. I read it twice, then a third time, my breath quickening. "I'm here too, Frank." My first thought was disbelief. We had been out of step for decades, and now he had followed me into this frozen corner of the world. I typed back, slowly, where his reply came fast: Anchorage. Same hotel lobby tomorrow morning. Sleep eluded me that night. My mind drifted between the green ribbons of the sky and the echo of our last argument, 2 brothers shouting in a hospital hallway while Evelyn lay fighting for breath. I had blamed him for not coming sooner. He had accused me of not telling him the truth of how bad she was. Pride had done the rest. We hadn't spoken since. And now, after all these years, his voice had returned at the very moment I had clawed myself free from collapse. In the morning, I found him waiting near the hotel fireplace, older, heavier, but still unmistakably my brother. His hair was white, his face lined, but his eyes were the same steel blue that mirrored my own. For a moment, we only stared. Then he said, "You look like hell, Frank." I snorted. "Takes one to know one." The ice cracked just enough for us to sit together. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire popped and tourists bustled around, but between us lay years of silence begging to be filled. Finally, Samuel said, "I heard about Claire, about Mark. I heard what they told you." My jaw tightened. "They don't want me anymore. Not at the table, not in their lives. They're scared, he said simply. Scared of what an old man taking up too much space. My voice rose sharper than I meant. Heads turned, but I didn't care. I gave them everything. I carried them through childhood, through grief, through storms. And they erase me like I'm clutter on the shelf. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze steady. You scared them by not breaking. That's what it is. You outlasted every excuse, every attempt to put you in a box. They don't know what to do with a man who refuses to shrink. The words sank deep. I wanted to argue, but the truth in them pressed against my ribs. Evelyn had once said something similar when the children were teenagers and kept testing limits. They push because you're solid, she had whispered to me in the dark. It's easier to lean on the strongest wall. I looked at Samuel, at the brother I had cast off, and felt a surge of shame. I wasn't solid when Evelyn died, I said quietly. I was broken, and I broke everything around me. He didn't flinch. So was I. But maybe it's time we stop punishing each other for surviving. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground shift beneath me, not from collapse, but from a new foundation taking root. Still, the wound of my children's words throbbed. They'll never forgive me for whatever picture they've painted of me. Then change the picture, Samuel said. Not for them, for you. The day passed in conversation, halting but honest. We spoke of childhood, of our father's stern hand, of Christmas mornings when the house smelled of pine and tobacco smoke. We spoke of Evelyn, her laugh, her sharp wit, her way of softening every hard edge between us. With each word, some of the bitterness loosened, though not all. I knew reconciliation was not instant, but the crack of light was enough. That evening, I sent another photo to the family group chat, Samuel and me side by side, the aurora blazing overhead. I wrote two brothers still standing. The reaction came swift. Claire called immediately, her voice tight with emotion. Dad, what is this, Uncle Sam? After all this time? Yes, I said evenly, after all this time. She hesitated, then said, Why didn't you tell us you were going? Why do this to us? My chest swelled, not with anger, but with a clarity that had been building since the letter, since the broken ornament. Because you told me not to come. Because you erased me. And I wanted you to see what you'd erased. Her breath caught on the line. I imagined her standing in her kitchen staring at the photo, the children around her, Tom hovering close. She tried again. We didn't mean it like that, Dad. Things are complicated. Life is complicated, I cut in. Family is complicated. But you don't cut someone out because it's easier. You fight for them. Silence stretched. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, uncertain. Dad, come home after. We'll talk. Mark joined the call, his voice rough. Dad, I'm sorry. About the money, about everything. I was selfish. I thought you'd always be there no matter what. My throat tightened, but I held steady. I was there. And you forgot. No one spoke. The line held all the weight of years. Then Claire whispered, Please, Dad. Come back. I looked at Samuel across the hotel room. He raised his brows as if asking what I would choose. For the first time in a long while, the decision was mine, not theirs. I'll think about it, I said and hung up. The room was quiet again, but inside me the storm swirled louder than ever. For the first time they were reaching back, but I wasn't sure if my hand still wanted to meet theirs. I turned to the window, the northern lights still rippling across the sky, and wondered what Evelyn would have told me in this moment. Then came a knock on the hotel door, slow, deliberate. Samuel looked at me puzzled. I opened it to find Claire standing there in the hallway, her coat dusted with snow. Claire's face in that hallway was not the face of a daughter triumphant or certain. It was the face of a woman who had suddenly remembered that blood runs deeper than convenience. Her eyes were rimmed red from travel, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but feared the sound of her own excuses. For a moment we just stood there, father and daughter strangers, who had once known each other by heart. Samuel stepped back, giving us room. His presence reminded me of the roots we share, the ties that twist and endure, even when storms strip them bare. I gestured Claire inside. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold, the snow melting from her boots onto the carpet. We sat at the small table near the window. She folded her hands, then unfolded them, restless as a child caught in a lie. "Dad," she began, "I don't know what came over me this year. I thought keeping it simple would make things easier." I studied her face, the lines of worry etched by years of raising her own children. She looked so much like Evelyn in that moment, the same furrow, when she carried more than she should. My anger softened, but it did not vanish. "Easier for you, maybe, but not for me." Her shoulders sagged. I was wrong. I let the words settle. They were not enough to erase the sting, but they were the start of something. I gave my whole life to building a home for you, for Mark, for your mother. That home is empty now, but it still breathes with what we made. And when you told me I wasn't welcome, you weren't just pushing me out of a holiday. You were pushing me out of that history. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't see it that way. "No," I said, my voice steady. "Because time made you forget what it cost to be a father. It cost nights without sleep, a back bent from labor savings drained to keep the lights on. But I gave it gladly. And maybe that's why you thought it was endless. But even fathers break when they are told they have no place." She reached across the table, her hand trembling. I looked at it, then placed mine over hers. Her skin was warm, fragile, the way Evelyn's had been in her last years. For the first time since that phone call, the tightness in my chest eased. Forgiveness is not a sudden flame. It is a slow thaw. Sitting there, I felt the first crack in the ice. I thought of Evelyn's voice, always urging me to see past hurt into the heart beneath. I thought of Samuel, who had come back into my life after years of silence, and how even the deepest wounds can knit if you let them. Justice in family is not about winning arguments. It is about being seen. For too long I had been invisible in their eyes, reduced to burden, to complication. But here in this small hotel room under a northern sky, I was visible again. That was all I ever wanted. We did not solve everything that night. Old habits and hurts do not dissolve in a single conversation. But as we spoke, halting, careful, honest, I felt the balance shift. Claire listened with a humility I had not heard from her in years. I found myself listening too, hearing the weight she carried as a mother, the fear of disappointing her husband, the confusion of juggling loyalty in too many directions. None of it excused what she had done, but it explained the cracks where love had leaked out. Later, when she rose to leave, I walked her to the door. The hallway was quiet, snow still falling beyond the glass. She turned to me, her breath visible in the cold air that rushed in. "Dad," she whispered, "I don't want to lose you." I touched her cheek the way I had when she was a girl with fever. "Then don't." When the door closed behind her, I stood with Samuel, silence wrapping us. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and we drank in memory of Evelyn, in memory of all the Christmases that had bound us once, and might still bind us again. That night, I lay in bed, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. I thought of the lights I had seen in the sky, how they danced even in the deepest cold. Families are like that, too. They flicker, they wane, they disappear for a time, but somewhere behind the dark, they are still burning, waiting for the right night to blaze again. I do not know what next Christmas will bring, whether I will sit at Claire's table or Mark's, or whether I will stand again beneath a foreign sky. But I know this: I will not vanish quietly. I will not let myself be erased. A father carries his worth, not in what is given back, but in the dignity he refuses to surrender. In the stillness, I spoke to Evelyn one last time. They will remember Evie. Not because I demanded it, but because I lived it. The wind rattled the window, and somewhere deep inside I felt peace settle like snow. Thanks for listening to the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to let us know what you think.